Today we're going to take a look at patterns 6 through 10, which is when we are now moving into what we call our action verb patterns. So think about how patterns 1 through 3 are all about to be verbs, and then pattern 4 and 5 were in our linking verbs. So now the linguists look at our language and say, well, there's a whole series of patterns that are based off of action verbs. There are 10 of them total. So today we're taking a look at pattern 6. So we're slowly learning our Roman numerals here. So that's a V and an I for 6. So pattern 6 starts off with an NP, which we know is a noun phrase. It's our subject. And we also have a verb. You'll notice I have this INT next to it. This is just short for the word intransitive. This is our way of saying, hey, this is an intransitive verb. I know it looks like there's 3 things here, but there's actually just 2. I want you to see it as red, the noun phrase, and green, the verb. But it's a particular verb. We're going to call it an intransitive verb. It's a type of action verb. Some action verbs require an object, and other action verbs can just simply stop. And so this is the kind of an action verb which stops, means that it doesn't transfer, doesn't move anywhere. Therefore, we would use the word intransitive. That's really what it comes from. I know, gripping stuff. Right. So building our basic form. Here's our basic format. We know that our noun phrase is always first and our verb is second. I'm going to call it a verb intransitive. Sometimes I'll just simply put AV for action verb. That helps you out. But particularly it's an intransitive verb. It looks very similar to pattern 1. All right? So pattern 1 and pattern 6 are sort of like buddies. The difference then is the type of verb. You'll notice, though, there's no adverbial. Remember, in pattern 1, you had to have an adverb or an adverbial there, because otherwise you have like a really strange sentence where you'd say something like, I am, as opposed to I am at school. So you just have this I am. It's very existential, I suppose. So here you're not having any adverbial. But the thing is our author points out, and hopefully you're reading in your book, that patterns 2 through 10 all have adverbs. Adverbs are oftentimes looked at as being optional, but everyone opts to have one, because without them, oftentimes your sentence seems very lacking. So except for pattern 1, where you have to have an adverb, patterns 2 through 10, you don't have to, but more likely you have adverbials, because they are what sort of adds color to the actual sentence, an actual meaning too. All right, so here's our first example. Let's do Alonzo swam in the Jello. All right, so we start off with our subject, which is going to be Alonzo, sitting right there, and our action verb, which is swam. We're going to call him an intransitive verb. Intransitive means that you're not going to say what, or you're not going to say whom to follow it. You're not saying Alonzo swam what or Alonzo swam whom. Basically, you're saying is Alonzo swam where? In the Jello. And so really, even though there's this prepositional phrase here, this is just optional. You don't have to have it. The pattern is established by these 2 words here. So we have this prep phrase in the Jello, tells us where Alonzo swam. So I'm going to put it underneath the word swam. I know you're like, wasn't it Alonzo in the Jello? He is, but it really tells me where he swam. So I'm building underneath the verb. And so it's closer to swam, makes more sense. So let's build down with the preposition and the noun first. So in and Jello, you get added in first, and then the is going to go underneath here. It's the Jello. Right? And it's a nice little pattern 1 for us. Right? Adds a nice little detail to the sentence, but you don't have to have it. It's purely optional. So I could say Alonzo swam. Yeah, it still makes sense. You see the difference? If I was a pattern 1, I could say Alonzo is in the Jello. But then I'm left with just to be Alonzo is. And that's why you have to have the adverb for the pattern 1. But for a pattern 6, you could just simply say Alonzo swam and put a period. And it's still a sentence. But you'll notice our point here is the adverb, or in this case, the adverbial prep phrase, really adds a little nice detail to the sentence. Kind of clarifies where Alonzo is swimming. All right. Thank you, baghead. Let's move on. Second one. Brainerd is knitting by the fire. All right, so here's Brainerd as our subject, and then our whole verb is knitting. That can be thrown off for people, but is knitting is your entire verb. So remember, is by itself is a to be verb. But when we're using it here as an auxiliary, remember we talked about auxiliaries, and so this auxiliary is which is to be working with the main verb knitting, and knitting's an action. But in this case, we're not saying Brainerd is knitting what. I never put anything there. I just simply have Brainerd is knitting, which makes it now intransitive. I could put a period at the end of that, and then I could end the sentence. So Brainerd is knitting, and then I have where he's knitting, which is by the fire. So it's not Brainerd by the fire, but he's knitting by the fire. So our first and last words, here's by and fire, and then the underneath it. There you go. Nice little pattern 6. Last example. Oh, it's a big one. The hippie was in the sunflower field and danced with his tambourine. Isn't that delightful? All right, so I can see my subject But I also know ahead of time, I can see I have two verbs. I have a was and a dance. So I'm going to split this verb already and get those two in here. So here's hippie. Hello, hippie. And then here's was and dance. Let's put a little conjunction in there with and. All right, and I can see already this is going to be interesting because I actually have two different patterns. Was has all the makings of either being a pattern 1, 2, or 3, but I don't have like the hippie was adjective, the hippie was noun. I have a hippie was where. So this is a pattern 1. And then down here I have an action verb, but I don't have hippie danced what or hippie danced whom. I don't have anything that's following it. This is like a little pattern 6 for me because I have this verb, and then I go into tell me where he danced, but I don't have anything that follows dance that tells me what or whom. And so therefore it's an intransitive verb. So this makes it a 6 in top 101. Let's add in those prep phrases. So there's hippie. In the sunflower field tells us about where the hippie was. He was in field. Remember, it's always the first and last words. And then what kind of field? It's the field and sunflower field. And then down here, he danced how? With his tambourine. So let's do with and tambourine. And let's add in that word his. We got to add. That looks nice. And once again, we have a pattern 1 up here. We have a pattern 6 down here. And you can have that. And so the same noun is going up here to a 1. The same noun is coming down here making a 6. All these extra prepositional phrases. This one's extra. This one helps make this one into a pattern 1. Tells us where the hippie was. Looks awesome. All right. So now try practicing pattern 6 before we move on to pattern 7.